She walked across the jet bridge and into the first-class cabin of Flight 447. She wore a simple black blazer over her arm and carried a worn-out leather messenger bag over her shoulder. When she was 45, she walked with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that real power comes from whispering, not yelling. She felt like she knew the burgundy carpet under her feet. She had taken this route from New York to Chicago every day for 8 years, just like she did her morning coffee. At row 2, she stopped and looked at her boarding pass. Give it another try. Seat 2A, the window seat, just the way she had asked for. But there, where she was supposed to be sitting, was a pricey Hermes handbag. The soft lighting in the cabin made the orange color of the bag stand out. "Excuse me," Samra said softly to the blonde woman in seat. She was in her early 50s and was wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people pay each month for rent. "This is where I sit." The woman looked up from her phone in a way that seemed slow and deliberate, used to only being interrupted by people she thought were important enough to talk to. She looked down at Samra's face, then up at her simple khaki pants and white cotton shirt, and then back up again. She was taking stock and clearly not happy with what she saw. "I don't think so, honey," she said, using the same sweet tone that moms use to tell kids they can't have candy before dinner. It seemed like someone said, "People like you don't sit here." The words were like smoke rising from an oven. Put out the match. The soft hum of conversations between people in first class stopped around them, as if everyone in the cabin had held their breath. The tight feeling in Samra's chest was like it always did. Not surprise, because she had seen this kind of casual cruelty before, but disappointment that some things had not changed, even here and now. She didn't raise her voice. "Highly skilled. I have my boarding pass right here." "Oh, I'm sure you do," he said. The woman answered, but she didn't even look at the piece of paper Samra was holding out. But there must have been some kind of mistake. Other people in the seats around them had started to notice the noise. 3 rows back, a man in a navy suit leaned forward a little. His face quickly changed from being interested to looking uncomfortably like he was looking forward to something. The person next to her turned to get a better look when a woman across the aisle whispered something to her. Samra stood there and looked at for a moment. She looked at the woman's face and remembered how her lips curled when she smiled without warmth. "I have flown this route for 8 years. For 8 years, we built something important. For 8 years, she showed that she belonged in places where people were shocked to see her. She thought you have no idea who you're dealing with." But she didn't say anything about it. She just pressed the call button above her head and said, "We'll see about that." The flight attendant who got back to the person who called Samra was a young man whose name tag said his name was Derek. He had perfectly styled hair and the kind of smile that customer service reps get better at after thousands of calls. He walked up with the look of someone who was a little stressed out and hoping this would be a quick and easy fix. He asked, "Is there a problem here, ladies?" But his eyes kept going to Samra with a clear question mark in them. The blonde woman had introduced herself to the flight attendant in a very polite way. "Is Margaret Sterling?" She started to explain right away. "Yes, it looks like there is some confusion about where to sit. I've been flying this airline's first class for more than 20 years and have never seen anything like this happen." Derek looked back and forth between the two women, and Samra could almost see him doing math behind closed eyes. Margaret Sterling looked exactly like every other first-class passenger he had served. She was dressed to impress, spoke with a sense of entitlement, and spoke loudly, with a certain accent that made me think of years spent in private schools and country clubs. Samara, dressed in clothes that were meant to be casual, was probably something that his training had never quite prepared him for. "Let me check the computer," Derek said as he took out his tablet. But the way he tapped the screen showed that he had already decided how to solve the problem, she said. "Ma'am," he told Sam, "it looks like we might have made a mistake with the upgrade. But we can move you to our very comfortable business class cabin." "And no," Samra said quietly, but with enough firmness that Derek stopped in the middle of a sentence. "I'd like you to check the reservation system again," Margaret agreed, saying, "That's a very good idea. Business class is nice," Samara continued, her voice never rising above a whisper. "I'd like to sit in seat 2, eh?" Derek nervously looked around. Other passengers were clearly paying attention to them, and Samara could feel the kind of attention that happens when people can smell conflict. Some people had put down their phones and magazines, while others pretended not to be listening while clearly straining to hear every word. Of course, Derek said, but his tone made it clear that this was not a normal conversation. Let me just confirm a few things. He looked at his tablet for too long and kept looking up at Samara as if she might confess to some kind of fraud. He stared at her long enough. Finally, he asked, "Could I see your boarding pass and ID?" Samara gave Derek both documents without saying a word. She knew that the fastest way to get through these situations was to comply, be patient, and keep careful records. Derek looked over her credentials with the kind of care that is usually reserved for suspected forgeries. But she didn't say anything. Derek finally said, "It looks like everything is fine," but he sounded almost disappointed by this. "But I'm going to need to call my boss just to make sure we handle this correctly," Margaret said, with the kind of smile that people wear when they're sure the universe will work in their favor. That makes perfect sense. Standards are important. Samara leaned back against the bulkhead to wait, her eyes moving around the cabin with the kind of she noticed things. Like how conversations had changed from business deals and vacation plans to whispered chatter about the drama in row 2. How some people had angled their bodies to get a better view, and how Margaret had placed her bag even more deliberately to take up more seat space. 8 years, Samara thought. 8 years of this exact flight, often in this exact seat. 8 years of building an empire that she had worked with thousands of people, including the people who were now questioning her right to be here. But she had always been very patient, so she knew she could wait. The supervisor Derek called was a woman named Linda, according to her more complicated name tag. She had silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades handling customer complaints in small spaces. She walked up with the weary efficiency of a veteran negotiator, but Samara noticed that her eyes went straight to Margaret, as if Shalinda said, "I understand we have a seating issue." Her voice had the professional neutrality that customer service managers used when they didn't want to take a side but had already chosen one. Margaret straightened up in her seat, acting like the reasonable person in an unreasonable situation. "I'm just trying to understand how this kind of mix-up happens. I've been a platinum member for 15 years. My name is Margaret. The company spends almost $1 million a year with this airline." Linda nodded with the kind of understanding that is only shown to loyal customers. Then she looked at Samara with a different expression, but with an underlying skepticism that Samara had seen many times before. "Ma'am," she said, "I need to see your ID and the credit card used to purchase this ticket." The request hung in the air like a challenge, and Samara could feel the attention of other people in the car were paying closer attention. A businessman 2 rows back had stopped pretending to read his financial magazine, and a woman across the aisle had her phone set up in a way that made it look like she might be recording. "You didn't ask her for her credit card," Samara said, nodding toward Margaret. Linda's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's what you do when there are questions about ticket validity." "Are there questions about ticket validity?" she asked Samara. "Well, yes, but what?" The question was asked so quietly that Linda had to lean forward to hear it clearly. Samara's tone suggested that this wasn't the first time she'd had to deal with these issues and that she had developed very specific skills for doing so. Margaret, sensing that the conversation wasn't going in the direction she had planned, decided to step in. "We're all trying to figure out how someone in your situation got a first-class seat. No offense, but you don't really look like you belong here." The words slammed into the cabin like rocks into still water. Conversations that had been whispered had stopped completely. Even the flight attendants getting ready for takeoff seemed to stop what they were doing. For the first time since they met, Samara turned her full attention to Margaret. The first time they talked, Samara looked at the other woman's face with such care that it made Margaret move around uncomfortably in her seat. "My situation?" she asked again. "Well, you know what I mean. Could you be more specific?" Margaret's face turned a little red, and she looked around at the other passengers, realizing that the conversation had changed. "Just meant, economically. People dress differently when they can actually afford first class." Samara's voice stayed level and almost conversational. And how exactly should someone who can afford first class be dressed? Margaret asked again, but with less conviction than before. I'm afraid I don't, Samra replied. Perhaps you could. Enlighten me. There was a moment of silence that made people aware of the sounds around them, the air conditioner humming, the ground crew getting ready to take off, and the plane's soft creaking. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Finally, an older man 3 rows back spoke up. Look, we all paid good money for these seats. We shouldn't have to deal with this kind of drama. Several people nodded their heads in agreement. A woman near the front of the plane asked, "Can't we just settle this so we can take off?" Samara felt the familiar weight of a group's impatience, the feeling that her very presence was causing trouble. She felt calm and collected, like she had been dealing with people who didn't think much of her for years. She took out her phone and sent a quick text message. Get ready for a possible PR situation. Flight 447 to Chicago. We'll let you know soon. Then she looked back at Linda and said, I'd like to talk to the captain. Linda's face changed from professional discomfort to something close to alarm. Ma'am, I don't think that's necessary. Let's try 2. I'd like to talk to the captain, Samra said again. And this time her tone made it sound like she wasn't willing to change her mind. Margaret was watching this exchange with growing confidence, as if she thought Samra's insistence was proof of guilt. You know what? We should tell the truth about what's going on here, I think. Some people just try to get around the rules. When they are caught, they make a big deal out of it in the hopes that everyone will back down. A whisper of there was agreement. In the first-class cabin, the businessman who had been listening in nodded his head in agreement. I agreed. Exactly. There are protocols for a reason. Samra asked again, protocols? That's an interesting choice of words. She stood up and reached for a small leather portfolio in the overhead compartment. She did this with deliberate calm. When Linda opened it, she saw what looked like business cards and papers that were meant to be official. Before Samra had shut it again, so she couldn't read anymore. These rules, Samra said as she sat back down in the aisle seat that Linda had apparently chosen to take temporarily. Do they apply to all passengers the same way? Linda said, of course they do, but her voice didn't sound sure. That means you would be happy to check Mrs. Sterling's credit card and ID as well if I asked you to. That's not the same. What's different about it? Margaret was starting to look less interested when Linda looked at her, at ease with the way the conversation is going. She is a known passenger. She often flies with us. How do you know I don't? Linda had a hard time finding the right words. It's pretty clear around them. The word hung in the air like a charge. There was so little noise in the cabin that every word could be heard clearly from the farthest row. How is it clear? He asked Samra. Margaret chose to be more direct, maybe because she thought Linda was losing control of the story. Let's be honest, honey. We all know what this is about. Some people think they can say racist things whenever they don't get their way, but the rest of us can see through it. She looked around the cabin, clearly hoping that someone would help her. Really? Come on, look at her. Take a look at her clothes. Take a look at how she acts. Does she look like someone who should be in first class? A number of people nodded. There was a man in a fancy suit who said, she's right, standards matter. Also, we paid premium prices for a premium experience. Samra had the familiar feeling of being on trial for the crime of being in a place where no one expected her to be. But Margaret didn't feel angry or defensive like she was trying to make her feel. Instead, she felt something else. A cold, clinical desire to write down exactly what would happen in this situation. She took out her phone again and started typing. A longer message. Record the discrimination incident on Flight 447. Several witness Ashev recordings of sound. Get the legal review team ready to go right away when you land. Margaret saw that the phone was being used and her voice got angry. Are you going to record this? You need to get permission to record people? Samra said this while looking down at her phone. In New York State, only one person needs to agree for a conversation to be recorded. Yes, I agree. Margaret said, this is harassment. Flight attendant, please take this woman off the plane right away. Linda seemed she was clearly lost and desperate as she looked around. I'm going to call the police, yes, Margaret said with pride. Call the police. Let them take care of this. Samra looked up when she was done with her text message. She said in a quiet voice, "That's a great idea. I believe it is time for us to hear some other points of view on this matter." Sarah sent one last message as Linda reached for her radio to call airport security. "Start Protocol 7. In 15 minutes. There will be a board meeting. Full paperwork is needed." The color Oz was cast, they say. The next 20 minutes were like a carefully choreographed dance between authority and resistance. Samara was in the middle of a performance that got more complicated and seemed to involve everyone in the first-class cabin. 2 airport police officers, a young black woman named Officer Thompson, and an older white man named Officer Rodriguez, came to keep everyone safe. Their arrival changed the mood in the cabin right away, turning what had been a social dynamics exercise into something else, into something that felt more official and important. Margaret, clearly pumped up by this news, immediately positioned herself as the reasonable person in a situation that was not reasonable. "Police, thanks for coming. This woman is making a fuss by not moving to her rightful seat, and now she's recording people without their permission." The way Officer Thompson looked at Samara was professional, but not in a mean way. "Ma'am, could you tell us your side of what's going on?" asked the man. "I'm sitting in the seat I paid for," Samara replied. "I was told I didn't belong here and that I was gaming the system when I asked why. I was being treated differently than other passengers. I have my boarding pass and identification. I've been asked to provide additional documentation that other passengers haven't been required to provide." She gave Officer Thompson her ID and boarding pass, which she carefully looked over before giving them to her partner. The seat officer Rodriguez said that the assignment seems to be right after talking to Linda and looking at her tablet. Margaret spoke up and said, "Well, it looks like there was a problem with the computer system. Things like this do happen. Important thing is to get it over with quickly so that everyone can move on." But by this time, the situation had caught the attention of people outside the immediate conflict. Other passengers had started to take sides, some directly and others through well-placed body language and deep glances. A man and woman from business class who looked to be in their 40s and were Asian American had moved forward to get a better look at what was going on. The woman spoke up. "Let me explain. We've been watching this whole time and it's pretty clear. What's going on?" This woman showed her ID and boarding pass. "What is different about how she's being treated?" Margaret snapped, "But no one asked you what you thought. You're not interested in this?" The man replied quietly. "In fact, it does concern us. We've gone through this kind of treatment before. We're aware of it." Margaret had a red face from being mad. Please, you're going to group up on me now. I'm talking about this exact thing. Some people are always together and make race the center of everything." "Who are those people?" the woman asked.
What?
"You understand what I mean, do we?" The conversation was beginning to attract passengers from economy class who were craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. Social media had entered the equation as well. Several passengers were now openly filming, and at least one person was live streaming the entire encounter. Margaret, perhaps sensing that the narrative was beginning to slip away from her, decided to escalate her approach. She stood up and addressed the cabin in general. "I want everyone to see what's happening here. Being attacked and harassed for simply pointing out that there are standards for first-class travel. I've been a loyal customer of this airline for years, and this is how I'm treated when I try to address a legitimate concern." She pulled out her own phone and began recording. "My name is Margaret Sterling. I'm being discriminated against on Flight 447 because I dared to question why someone who clearly doesn't belong in first class is trying to take my seat." "Your seat?" Samra asked quietly. "The seat next to mine? You know what I meant?" "Actually, I don't think I do." Margaret turned her phone towards Samra. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what we're dealing with. Someone who thinks she can bully her way into first class and then play the victim when she gets called out." The live stream was apparently attracting viewers in real time because Margaret's phone began buzzing with notifications. She glanced at the screen and smiled with satisfaction. Hundreds of people are watching this. You can see exactly what's happening. Officer Thompson stepped between Margaret and Samra. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop recording and sit down." "Why should I stop recording? I have rights. Yes, you do. So does everyone else on this plane. Right now, you're creating a disturbance. I'm creating a disturbance. She's the one who started all this. Samra, who had been observing this escalation with what appeared to be detached interest, finally spoke up. Officer Thompson, I'd like to make a formal complaint about discriminatory treatment by airline staff. Ma'am, we can certainly help you file that complaint once we resolve the immediate situation. Actually, Samara said, checking her phone, which had been buzzing consistently for the past several minutes. I think the situation is about to resolve itself. As if on cue, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison. We're going to have a brief delay while we address an urgent situation. I apologize for any inconvenience. Margaret looked triumphant. Finally, someone with authority is going to handle this properly. Samra smiled forth. First time since boarding the plane. It was not a particularly warm smile. Yes, she said quietly. Someone with authority. The intercom crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't Captain Morrison's voice that filled the cabin. Instead, a different voice, older, more authoritative. With the particular cadence of someone accustomed to addressing large groups, spoke clearly to the entire plane. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Michael Richardson, Chief Executive Officer of Airline XYZ. I apologize for this unusual interruption, but I need to address an extremely serious situation that has come to my attention aboard Flight 447. The cabin, which had been buzzing with conversation and speculation, fell into complete silence. Even Margaret lowered her phone, her expression shifting from triumph to confusion. It has been brought to my attention that a passenger is being subjected to discriminatory treatment by our staff and harassment by other passengers. This passenger is Miss Samara Williams, who serves as Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Williams Industries. The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Margaret's face went pale. Linda, the flight attendant supervisor, looked like she might be sick. Several passengers who had been recording suddenly stopped, as if they'd realized. They might have been documenting something very different from what they'd intended. For those who may not be familiar with Ms. Williams' company, the CEO continued, Williams Industries is the parent corporation that owns a controlling 51% stake in Airline XYZ. Ms. Williams is not only our largest shareholder, she is also the architect of our industry-leading diversity and inclusion policies. The silence in the cabin was now absolute. Even the mechanical sounds of the aircraft seemed muted. Furthermore, Ms. Williams has been a regular passenger on our flights for over 8 years, and she is personally known to our senior management team. Any employee who has participated in discriminatory bereave toward Ms. Williams will face immediate termination. Any passenger who has recorded or harassed Ms. Williams may be permanently banned from our airline. Samara calmly reached into her leather portfolio and withdrew a tablet computer. With a few taps, she brought up a screen that clearly displayed her corporate credentials, board positions, and a photo ID that left no doubt about her identity. Margaret stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing silently. Ms. Williams. The CEO's voice continued, on behalf of the entire Airline XYZ organization, I offer you our most sincere apologies. A full investigation into this incident will begin immediately. Officer Thompson, who had been watching this unfold with professional interest, stepped forward. Ma'am, is there anything you need from us at this point? Samara looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers who had been so confident in their judgments just moments before. Margaret was no longer making eye contact with anyone. The businessman who had been so vocal about standards was staring at his hands. Linda appeared to be having what might generously be called a career-limiting realization. I think Samra said quietly that the situation is well in hand. Captain Morrison's voice returned to the intercom. Ms. Williams, please accept our apologies. For this inexcusable treatment, we are prepared to make any accommodations necessary to ensure your comfort for the remainder of your journey. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't know. Had no idea who you were? Samra turned to look at her directly for the first time since the CEO's announcement. And if I had been exactly who you thought I was, would that have made your behavior acceptable? Margaret had no answer for that question. The Asian American couple who had defended Samara earlier approached cautiously. Miss Williams, we're so sorry this happened to you. Thank you for handling it with such grace. Thank you for speaking up, Samara replied. That took courage. Around the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Passengers who had been watching the drama with entertainment or mild support for Margaret were now avoiding eye contact and whispering apologies. The people who had been live streaming were frantically trying to delete their videos. Officer Rodriguez approached Samara with professional respect. Ma'am, would you like to file formal charges against anyone? Samara considered this for a moment, her eyes moving around the cabin one more time. I think, she said finally, that some people have learned enough for one day. But her expression suggested that while forgiveness might be possible, forgetting was another matter entirely. The consequences unfolded with the swift efficiency of a corporate crisis management plan, which, as it turned out, was exactly what it was. Linda received a call on her radio within minutes of the CEO's announcement. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and final. Miss Patterson, your employment with Airline XYZ has been terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the aircraft. Your personal belongings will be sent to you. Linda's face crumpled as the reality of her situation hit her. 8 years with the company gone in an instant. She looked at Samara with something between pleading and horror. But Samara's expression remained neutral, almost clinical. Ma'am, I didn't mean, Linda began. You meant exactly what you said, Samara replied quietly. The question is whether you understand why that was wrong. Security personnel appeared to escort Linda from the plane, leaving the remaining flight. Attendants to deal with a cabin full of passengers who were rapidly reassessing their own positions in this unfolding drama. Margaret had stopped recording and was now frantically trying to delete the video she'd posted. But the notification sounds from her phone suggested it was too late. Screenshots and screen recordings had already begun circulating, and the story was taking on a life of its own across social media platforms. Her phone rang, and she answered it with a trembling voice. Hello, what? No, I can explain. She listened for a moment, her face growing paler. You can't be serious. This is just a misunderstanding. But apparently Margaret's employer, a consulting firm that specialized in corporate communications, was very serious indeed. The conversation ended with Margaret staring at her phone in disbelief. The Asian American couple had began documenting their own experience of the incident, but their version focused on Samara's composure and dignity rather than the conflict itself. This is what leadership looks like, the woman said into her phones. Camera, grace under pressure, and the wisdom to know that true power doesn't need to announce itself. Meanwhile, Nancy, the lawyer who had supported Margaret earlier, was dealing with her own crisis. Her live stream had been viewed by thousands of people, including several colleagues from her law firm. Her phone was buzzing with increasingly urgent messages from her managing partner. I need to make a statement, Nancy announced to no one in particular. This has all been taken out of context. What context would make this appropriate? Asked the businessman who had previously supported Margaret, but was now trying to distance himself from the entire situation. Nancy had no answer for that either. Samara's own phone had been buzzing constantly. She'd been ignoring it, in favor of observing the human drama unfolding around her. Finally, she answered a call. Yes, I'm fine, she said quietly. No, I don't think legal action will be necessary at this point. Yes, I understand the PR implications. No, I want to handle the statement myself. She ended the call and looked around the cabin, which had transformed from a space of casual luxury into something resembling a courtroom after a particularly decisive verdict. Captain Morrison appeared in the cabin doorway, still wearing his pilot's uniform, but with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had been given very clear instructions about how to handle this situation. Ms. Williams, he said with genuine respect, I want to personally apologize for what you've experienced today. This is not who we are as an airline, and it's certainly not how we treat our most valued stakeholders. Samara nodded graciously. Thank you, Captain. I appreciate that. We'd like to offer your corporate jet for the remainder of your journey if that would be acceptable. "That's very kind, but I think I'll stay right here," Samra said, settling back into seat 2A with a slight smile. "After all, I did pay for this seat." Margaret, who had been listening to this exchange in mounting horror, finally understood the full scope of her miscalculation. This wasn't just about embarrassment or even job loss. This was about the fact that her behavior was now part of a permanent record that would follow her for the rest of her career. The irony was lost on no one. In trying to humiliate someone she perceived as beneath her, Margaret had instead provided a masterclass in how power actually works in the modern world. The real power had been sitting quietly next to her the entire time, waiting to see how far ignorance and prejudice would carry the day. As it turned out, they hadn't carried it very far at all. 2 hours later, as Flight 447 finally achieved cruising altitude, Samara found herself in the unusual position of being the most talked about passenger in first class, but for entirely different reasons than when she'd first boarded. The cabin had settled into an uncomfortable quiet, with most passengers either sleeping, working, or staring at their phones where the story was continuing to unfold across social media platforms. The airplane incident was trending, but not in the way Margaret had intended. A flight attendant, one who hadn't been involved in the earlier incident, approached Samara carefully. "Ms. Williams, is there anything I can get for you?" "Actually, yes," Samara said thoughtfully. "Could you ask if any of the passengers would like to have a conversation about what happened today? Not for cameras or social media, just a conversation." Word spread through the cabin, and within minutes, several passengers had gathered around Samara's seat. The Asian-American couple was there, along with the businessman who had initially supported Margaret, but was now clearly having second thoughts. Even a few passengers from business class had joined the group. "I want to be clear about something," Samara began, her voice carrying easily in the intimate space. "Today wasn't about me being powerful enough to fight back. Today was about revealing systemic problems that most people of color face every day, but without the resources to address them." She looked around the group, making eye contact with each person. "I was fortunate enough to be in a position where discrimination had immediate consequences for the people practicing it. But most people aren't in that position. Most people just have to absorb the humiliation and move on." The businessman shifted uncomfortably. "I guess I never thought about it that way." "That's the problem," Samara said gently. "People don't think about it until they're forced to witness it directly. And even then, it's easier to assume there must be some reasonable explanation than to acknowledge what's actually happening." A woman from business class raised her hand tentatively. "What should we have done? I mean, those of us who saw what was happening but didn't know how to intervene." "You speak up," said the Asian American woman, "even when it's uncomfortable, especially." "When it's uncomfortable?" Samara nodded. "Discrimination thrives in silence. It depends on bystanders deciding that it's not their problem, that they don't want to get involved, or that surely someone else will handle it." She pulled out her tablet and showed them a press release that was already going live on Williams Industries' website. "We're announcing a new initiative today. Anonymous reporting systems for discrimination across all companies in our portfolio. Whistleblower protection for employees who report. BIAs and mandatory bias training for anyone in a management position." "You're turning this into something positive," observed the businessman. "I'm turning this into something useful," Samara corrected. "My grandmother cleaned airplanes for 40 years and never sat in first class. Today I fly in first class because representation in boardrooms matters. But it only matters if we use that representation to change systems, not just to protect ourselves." She stood up and addressed the larger group that had gathered. "Every interaction is a choice, can perpetuate bias or challenge it. You can stay silent when you see discrimination, or you can speak up. You can assume that someone doesn't belong somewhere because of how they look. Or you can examine why you made that assumption." The conversation continued for another hour, with passengers sharing their own experiences and asking questions they'd never thought to ask before. It wasn't a perfect dialogue. There were moments of defensiveness and discomfort, but it was real in a way that most airplane conversations never are. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, Samara returned to her seat and looked out the window at the city spreading below. In a few hours, this story would be in the news cycle. By tomorrow, it would probably be a case study in business schools. By next week, it would be part of corporate training materials. But right now, in this moment, it was simply a reminder that change happens one conversation at a time, one choice at a time, one person deciding to be better than they were yesterday. As Flight 447 touched down at O'Hare International Airport, Samra gathered her belongings with the same quiet efficiency she'd displayed throughout the entire ordeal. The other passengers watched her with a mixture of respect, curiosity, and in some cases, what appeared to be genuine remorse for their earlier assumptions. Margaret had spent the final hour of the flight in what could only be described as a state of shock, alternating between staring at her phone, which continued to buzz with notifications about the viral video, and shooting furtive glances at Samra. As they prepared to disembark, she finally worked up the courage to approach. "Miss Williams," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Samra looked at her with those same careful, measuring eyes that had been taking inventory since the moment they'd first met.
Us.
"Do you? I was wrong. I was acting on assumptions I didn't even realize I had. And if I hadn't turned out to be the CEO of your airline's parent company, what would you be saying to me then?" Margaret had no answer, which was in itself an answer. "That's the real question, isn't it?" Samra said gently. "Whether you think what you did was wrong because of who I turned out to be, or because of what you actually did?" She slung her messenger bag over her shoulder and moved toward the exit, but paused at the airplane door to address the small crowd of passengers who had gathered. "I'll leave you with this thought," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "Every interaction is a choice. Every day you choose whether to see people as individuals or as representatives of whatever group you think they belong. 2. You choose whether to speak up when you see discrimination or to stay silent because it's easier." She looked directly at the passengers who had supported Margaret earlier. "You choose whether to examine your own biases or to assume that your first instincts are always correct." Then she turned to the passengers who had defended her. "And you choose whether to use your voice only when it's safe and convenient or when it's actually needed." As she stepped off the plane, Samra pulled out her phone and posted a single message to her LinkedIn account. "Today, I was reminded that the seat you try to deny someone might belong to your future boss. But more importantly, I was reminded that every person deserves dignity, regardless of who their boss turns out to be. Choose better. Select honor. Do the right thing." Many people shared the post a lot in the first hour. Margaret Sterling was still looking for work after 6 months. Her name was now the same thing, as unconscious bias can be found in corporate training materials from many different industries. Nancy, the lawyer, had left her firm and started a practice focused on discrimination law, specializing in cases where her clients had been treated the way she had treated Samara. Linda, the flight attendant, found work with a smaller airline, and reportedly became one of their most effective diversity trainers. Using her own experience as a cautionary tale about the cost of assumptions, the Asian American couple who had spoken up became advocates for B-standard intervention training in corporate environments. They often spoke at conferences about the importance of allyship in action, not just in theory. And Samra Williams continued to fly commercial, usually in seat 2A, watching and learning, and occasionally being surprised by how much one conversation on an airplane could change the way people thought about power, privilege, and the choice to be better than you were yesterday. The lesson, as she often said in interviews about the incident, wasn't about revenge. It was about revelation, revealing the systems and assumptions that allowed discrimination to flourish and choosing to build something better in their place. After all, the seat you tried to deny someone today might belong to your future boss tomorrow. But more importantly, it belongs to a human being today. And that should be reason enough to choose dignity, choose justice, and choose better every single